She walked through the school gates just as the morning bell rang, holding a small brown bag and a stack of papers close to her chest. Her steps were quiet, almost unnoticed among the chatter of students rushing to their classrooms. Her name was Lena, though few people at the school used it. Most simply called her the substitute or the quiet one. She never seemed to mind. Her clothes were plain: soft gray sweater, long skirt, flat shoes. Her hair was tied neatly in a bun, and her face always carried a calm expression that made it hard to guess what she was thinking. She spoke gently, never raised her voice, and always greeted others with a polite smile. But in a place where loudness and confidence stood out, her silence made her invisible. The students barely noticed when she entered their classroom. Some whispered jokes, others continued chatting. She placed her books on the desk, wrote a few words on the board, and began her lesson in a soft tone. Her voice was steady, kind, but hardly anyone listened. One boy in the back whispered to his friend, "She talks like she's reading a bedtime story." The friend laughed quietly, and the sound of muffled giggles spread across the room. Lena paused for a second, then continued teaching as if she hadn't heard. She had learned long ago that silence was sometimes the only shield a person needed. When the bell finally rang, she gathered her notes, straightened the desks that had been left messy, and gave a faint smile to the few students who had stayed behind to ask a question or two. Outside, in the teacher's lounge, the noise was different. It was filled with laughter, teasing, and chatter about students' families and weekend plans. Lena would sit quietly at the end of the table with her small lunchbox, usually just a sandwich and a thermos of tea. She listened more than she spoke, nodding politely whenever someone addressed her. But most of the time they didn't. A few teachers joked behind her back, thinking she didn't notice. "She's so quiet, it's spooky," one of them said once, laughing. "Maybe she's hiding something." Another replied, "Or maybe she's just boring." They laughed, not realizing she could hear every word. Lena only looked down at her tea and smiled faintly. She had heard worse before. That day, however, something happened that would stay in her mind. During lunch, one of the teachers, Mr. Clark, found an old violin in the corner of the music room. It was dusty, with one string missing, but the case looked expensive. He brought it into the lounge, holding it like a discovery. "Look what I found," he said. "This old thing must have been here since the last century." Everyone laughed, and one of the teachers joked, "Maybe we should start a staff band." Another said, "Or give it to Lena. She looks like she'd play something like that." The room filled with laughter again. The comment wasn't meant to be cruel, but it carried that teasing tone that left a sting. Lena looked up slowly, meeting their eyes for just a second. She didn't say a word, just smiled politely and went back to her lunch, but Mr. Clark wasn't done. "Come on, Lena," he said jokingly. "How about you play us a little tune at the school event next week? You know, something classical." More laughter followed. Someone added, "Yes, she could open the event with a lullaby." Lena's heart beat faster, but her face didn't change. She looked up, still calm, and said softly, "All right." The laughter stopped. "Wait, you're serious?" one of them asked. Lena nodded. "If you'd like me to play, I can." The room went silent for a moment, then the jokes returned, louder this time. But Lena didn't join in. She simply finished her tea, stood up, and left the lounge quietly. As the door closed behind her, a strange quietness lingered. One of the younger teachers frowned. "Maybe we went too far," she said. Mr. Clark waved his hand. "Relax, she won't actually do it." But they were wrong. That evening, when Lena reached her small apartment, she placed her bag on the table and sat down by the window. Outside, the city lights flickered faintly, and the sound of traffic echoed from afar. The violin comment kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't the first time she had been teased, but something about this one felt different. Maybe because it reminded her of who she used to be. She stood up and went to the closet in the corner of the room. Inside, beneath an old coat and a few boxes, lay a polished black violin case. She pulled it out slowly, brushing off the thin layer of dust that had gathered over time. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was a violin unlike the broken one from school. Its surface gleamed under the soft light, and the strings still held their shine. She touched it gently, as if afraid it would disappear. Then she picked up the bow and rested it against the strings. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, almost without realizing, she began to play. The sound that filled the small apartment was soft at first, then grew deeper, fuller. Notes poured out like a story being retold after years of silence. Her fingers moved with memory, her body swaying gently with each note. The walls that had seen only quiet evenings now echoed with music that carried both sadness and beauty. Tears welled in her eyes as she played, but she didn't stop. The melody wasn't just music. It was a piece of her past coming back to life. Years ago, before she became a substitute teacher, Lena had stood on grand stages, performing for hundreds. She had been known for her emotion, her precision, her gift of turning pain into harmony. But that was before life had changed everything. A sudden illness in her family had forced her to step away from the spotlight. When she lost someone she loved deeply, she couldn't bear to hear music anymore. The violin that once gave her purpose now reminded her of pain, so she had put it away, leaving behind that chapter of her life. But that night something shifted. Maybe it was the mockery that reignited a forgotten fire, or maybe it was her own heart asking to be heard again. Either way, the music returned, and with it, a strength she thought she had lost forever. When the final note faded, the room felt different. It was no longer heavy with silence. It was alive again. Lena set the violin down gently and wiped her eyes. She didn't smile, but there was a quiet determination in her face. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. The next morning at school, she looked the same as always. Simple clothes, calm expression. But inside, something had changed. When she passed the teachers who had laughed the day before, she greeted them kindly. Some avoided her eyes, unsure if she was angry. She wasn't. That afternoon, she walked into the empty music room. The old broken violin still sat on the table. She picked it up, ran her fingers along the wood, and smiled faintly. "You may not sound perfect," she whispered, "but you still have a voice." For the rest of the week, she spent her evenings in the music room after classes, practicing quietly. At first, a few teachers laughed when they saw her carrying the violin case, but soon they stopped. There was something in the way she carried it, something steady, sure. One evening, a janitor passing by heard her playing through the door. He paused, surprised by the sound. It wasn't the squeaky noise of an amateur. It was rich, emotional, almost haunting. He stood there for a long moment, listening before walking away in silence. The day of the school event was still a week away, but whispers had already begun to spread. "Did you hear? Lena's actually going to perform," someone said in the hallway. Some laughed, others shrugged. But a few grew curious. Lena didn't mind the talk. For the first time, she wasn't trying to hide. Each night, she returned to her small apartment, practiced until midnight, and then sat by the window with her cup of tea. She didn't think about fame or proving anyone wrong. She simply wanted to play, for herself, for the memory of those she loved, and for the peace that music always brought her. And though no one else knew it yet, Lena was ready. In her heart, she wasn't just the quiet teacher anymore. She was the woman who once made people cry through her music, who had lost everything and still found a way to stand again. When she finally set the violin down that night, she looked at her reflection in the window. The face looking back wasn't plain, it was peaceful. She smiled softly, knowing that the world would soon see a part of her they never imagined existed. The morning sun poured through the classroom windows, painting the floor in pale gold. Lena stood by the board, writing down the day's lesson. Her handwriting was neat, steady, the kind that came from years of patience and care. The students trickled in, whispering among themselves, a few glancing at her curiously. The rumor had spread. She was going to play at the school event. Some found it funny. Others didn't believe it at all. One student muttered to another, "Why would she even try? She's too shy to talk, let alone perform." But Lena didn't seem to hear. She greeted them warmly, started her lesson, and carried on as usual. After class, when the room emptied, she stayed behind for a moment. Her eyes rested on the small violin case she had placed on the desk. It wasn't the polished one from home. It was the school's old cracked violin. She had decided that she would play on this one. It wasn't perfect, but neither was life, and she felt that somehow the two belonged together. She lifted it gently, ran her fingers along the worn-out surface, and smiled faintly. The instrument might have been forgotten by others, but to her it was alive. She believed that even broken things could still make beautiful sounds if treated with love. As she left the room, she crossed paths with Mr. Clark in the hallway. He gave her a surprised look. "You're really serious about this?" he asked, half smiling. Lena nodded politely. "I said I would," he chuckled awkwardly. "All right then, good luck. You'll need it with that old thing." She didn't respond, just smiled and walked past him. Her calmness unsettled him more than any argument could have. That afternoon, when the final bell rang, Lena went to the music room. It was quiet and dim, the scent of old wood and dust filling the air. The piano in the corner stood untouched, and stacks of sheet music leaned against the walls. She opened one of the windows to let in some light, then sat down and began tuning the violin. The first few notes came out rough, screeching, far from perfect, but she didn't stop. Her movements were slow, deliberate, patient. Every day after school she returned to that room, practicing until the janitor came to lock up. The echo of her playing drifted through the empty hallways, soft at first, then stronger as the days passed. At first, the other teachers didn't pay attention. But one evening, as they left the building, a few of them paused by the corridor. The faint sound of music floated out of the music room, clear, emotional, filled with something that didn't belong to the quiet woman they thought they knew. "She's really doing it," one whispered. Mr. Clark frowned. "Maybe she's just lucky with the notes." But deep down, even he could tell there was more to it. There was feeling in that sound. Over the next few days, people started to notice small changes in Lena. She seemed lighter, her eyes brighter. The children who used to ignore her now looked at her differently. One day, a young student approached her after class, holding a small notebook. "Miss, is it true you're playing at the event?" Lena smiled softly. "Yes, I am," the girl grinned. "Can I come early to watch you practice?" Lena hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Of course, but you must promise to listen quietly." The next afternoon, the girl sat on a bench in the corner while Lena practiced. At first she fidgeted, but soon she sat still, completely drawn in by the sound. When the music stopped, she whispered, "It's beautiful." Lena smiled, her heart warming at the words. It had been so long since she had shared her music with anyone. By the end of the week, more students began to stop by, quietly listening outside the door. They didn't laugh or whisper this time. They just stood, amazed by the melody that came from the woman they had once ignored. Meanwhile, the teachers began to feel uneasy. The teasing that once felt harmless now felt heavy. Some tried to apologize in small ways, holding doors open, offering kind words, but Lena never mentioned the jokes again. She treated them the same as always, with quiet respect. One afternoon, the school principal visited the music room after hearing the rumors. He stood silently as Lena played, the soft light from the window falling across her face. When she finished, he clapped gently. "That was extraordinary," he said. "I had no idea." Lena smiled politely. "It's just practice, sir." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. You've given this school something special." Word began to spread beyond the teachers. Parents heard about the quiet teacher with the violin. Some thought it was exaggerated gossip, but others grew curious. The anticipation for the school event began to grow. At home, Lena continued her nightly routine. After dinner, she would light a small lamp, open the violin case, and play until she felt her heart slow down. Her music told stories she couldn't speak out loud, stories of love, loss, and hope. Sometimes she stopped midway, closing her eyes as tears formed, but she always began again. One evening, as she played, a neighbor knocked on her door. When she opened it, an elderly woman stood there, smiling kindly. "I hope you don't mind me saying this," the neighbor said, "but your music reminds me of my husband. He used to play the violin before he passed. When I hear you, it feels like he's here again." Lena's eyes softened. "Thank you. I didn't mean to disturb you." "Oh dear," the woman said, shaking her head. "You don't disturb me at all. You bring peace to this building." When the neighbor left, Lena sat for a long time in silence. The comment touched her deeply. For years she had hidden her talent, believing it brought only pain. Now it seemed to bring comfort, to her and to others. As the day of the event drew closer, Lena practiced harder. The piece she chose wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was gentle, emotional, something that spoke from the heart. She wanted it to reflect who she truly was. Not a performer trying to impress, but a person sharing a piece of her soul. On the last rehearsal day, she stayed late at school. The janitor, who had grown used to hearing her play, stopped by the door before locking up. "You know," he said, "I think you're going to surprise a lot of people." Lena smiled softly. "Maybe, but I'm not doing it to surprise anyone. I just want to play." He nodded. "That's what makes it special." The next morning, the school buzzed with energy. Decorations were hung, chairs arranged in the hall, and the sound of laughter filled the air. The teachers hurried about, checking programs and schedules. In the corner, Lena quietly tuned her violin. Some of the same teachers who had laughed at her before now approached her nervously. "Hey, Lena," one said, "we're looking forward to your performance." She smiled gently. "Thank you," another added. "You've been practicing hard." "We shouldn't have—" But she stopped herself, unsure how to finish. Lena simply nodded. "It's all right." Her calmness disarmed them completely. When the final bell rang, signaling the start of the event, the students filed into the hall, chattering excitedly. Parents filled the back rows, and the principal welcomed everyone on stage. Performances went by one. Dance routines, poems, short plays. Then it was time. The lights dimmed slightly, and the principal announced, "Now, a special performance by one of our own teachers, Miss Lena." A ripple of whispers went through the crowd. Lena stepped onto the stage, holding the old violin. The spotlight felt warm on her face, but she didn't look nervous. She stood still for a moment, taking a deep breath. The audience grew quiet. In that pause, everything she had felt, the teasing, the loneliness, the years of silence, melted away. She lifted the violin, placed the bow against the strings, and began to play. The first notes floated softly through the hall. The sound was delicate, tender, like a voice telling a story no one had heard before. People leaned forward in their seats. The music grew richer, deeper, filling the room with emotion. There was sadness in it, but also peace. No one moved. No one whispered. Even the youngest students sat in silence, mesmerized. When she reached the final note, it hung in the air for a moment before fading into stillness. Then all at once, the room erupted in applause. People stood, clapping and cheering. Some had tears in their eyes. Lena lowered her bow, smiled softly, and gave a small nod of gratitude. She didn't need to say a word. Her music had spoken for her. As she stepped off the stage, a few of the teachers who had once laughed now looked at her with awe. Mr. Clark was among them, his expression filled with guilt and admiration. "I had no idea," he murmured. Lena looked at him kindly. "Few ever do," she said gently. That night, as she walked home, the air felt lighter. The world around her seemed a little brighter, the stars a little clearer. She carried the violin close to her chest, not as a burden, but as a part of herself she had finally reclaimed. And though she didn't know it yet, her performance that night would change everything. Not just how others saw her, but how she saw herself. The morning after the performance, the school felt different. The air carried a strange sense of quiet respect. Students whispered in the hallways, teachers spoke in softer tones, and even the principal seemed unusually thoughtful. Everyone had seen what happened the night before. The woman they once ignored had stood on that stage and turned silence into music that touched every heart in the room. Lena walked through the corridor as she always did, calmly, without hurry. But now heads turned when she passed. Students who once looked past her now greeted her shyly. "Good morning, miss," one of them said with a smile. Another added, "Your playing was amazing." Lena smiled gently in return, her eyes warm. "Thank you," she said simply. She didn't say more because she didn't need to. In the teacher's lounge, things were quieter than usual. When she walked in, a few of the teachers who had laughed at her before fell silent. Mr. Clark stood near the window, pretending to read a notice, though he was really just avoiding her gaze. The others looked embarrassed, unsure what to say. Finally, one of them spoke up. "Lena," she said softly, "your performance last night was beautiful. Truly, I think none of us expected that." Lena smiled faintly. "Neither did I," she replied, pouring herself a cup of tea. There was a pause, then another teacher said, "You must have played for a long time before. You looked professional up there." Lena hesitated, her eyes distant for a moment. "A long time ago, yes," she said quietly. Then she took her tea and went to her usual seat in the corner. After she left the room, Mr. Clark exhaled. "I can't believe we made fun of her," he said under his breath. The others nodded, guilt spreading through the room. That afternoon, when the school day ended, Two students approached Lena in the hallway. They looked nervous but excited. "Miss," one of them said, "could you teach us to play like you?" "We want to learn the violin." Her eyes softened. "Of course," she said, "but it will take time and patience. Are you ready for that?" They nodded eagerly, and for the first time, she felt a spark of joy teaching not just lessons from a book, but something from her heart. Over the next few weeks, Lena began holding small music sessions after school. At first, only a few students came, but word spread quickly, and soon the room filled with children holding old violins, recorders, or whatever instruments they could find. Some sounded terrible at first, but she never scolded them. She only smiled and said, "Every note you play has meaning. Don't rush. Feel it." Her calm voice and gentle encouragement made the students feel safe to try, even when they made mistakes. Slowly, the sound of laughter and music began to replace the quiet halls after class. One day, while the students practiced, the principal stopped by the room. He leaned quietly against the doorframe, listening to the rough but cheerful melody filling the air. When the class ended, he clapped softly. "This is wonderful, Lena," he said. "You've brought something new to this school." Lena smiled. "Music teaches patience," she replied. "And maybe kindness, too." The principal nodded. "Would you consider starting a proper music program? I think the students would love it." She paused for a moment, thinking. It had been years since she had been part of anything official related to music, but looking at the smiling faces around her, she nodded. "Yes," she said quietly. "I'd like that." As the new program began, curiosity about Lena's past started to grow. The teachers whispered among themselves, trying to understand how someone so quiet, so humble, could play like a master. One evening, Mr. Clark couldn't resist his curiosity. He searched her name online. At first, nothing appeared. But then he came across an old newspaper article titled, "The Young Violin Virtuoso Who Captivated Vienna." He clicked on it, and as the page loaded, his mouth fell open. There, in a photo taken years ago, was Lena, standing on a grand stage, holding a violin, bowing before a large audience. The caption read, "Lena R., once hailed as one of the brightest talents in classical music." Mr. Clark read the article carefully. It described her rise in the music world, her international performances, and her reputation as a violinist whose emotion could move even the coldest hearts. Then, near the end, it mentioned something else. A sudden disappearance from public life after a family tragedy. He leaned back in his chair, shocked. The quiet woman who now graded papers in the corner had once played on world stages. He felt a heavy mix of awe and guilt. The next day, he approached her after school. "Lena," he began hesitantly, I found something online. About you." She looked up from her desk, calm but alert. "About me?" "Yes, an article. From years ago, you were famous." Lena said nothing for a moment, then smiled faintly. "That was another life." He hesitated. "Why did you stop?" She looked down at her hands, the faint trace of a tremor in her fingers. "Because music isn't just sound," she said softly. "It's memory. And sometimes when memories hurt, you have to let silence take their place for a while." He didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, feeling the weight of her words. After he left, Lena sat quietly for a while, staring at the violin on her desk. She hadn't meant for anyone to find out. She had left that part of her life behind because it carried too much pain, but perhaps it was time to stop hiding completely. That evening, as she walked home, she passed a small park. She sat on a bench watching children play, their laughter ringing through the air. A little boy nearby was trying to play a toy flute, making more noise than music. His mother laughed, not scolding him, but encouraging him. Lena smiled to herself. That was what music should be. Joy, not pressure. When she reached home, she opened her violin case again. She played softly, this time without tears. The sound was not for performance, not for applause, but for peace. In the following days, the story about her past quietly spread through the school. Students began looking up her old performances online. Some of them even brought printed pictures of her, amazed at how different she looked, confident, radiant, full of life. But what surprised them most was how humble she remained. She never mentioned her fame, never corrected anyone, never asked for attention. She continued teaching with the same calm patience as before. One afternoon, a student said, "Miss, you used to play in big places. Don't you miss it?" Lena paused for a moment. "Sometimes," she said softly. But I've learned something. Music isn't about where you play. It's about why you play. The girl looked puzzled. What do you mean? Lena smiled gently. When I played for crowds, I wanted to be perfect. Now I just want to be honest, and that feels better. As the weeks passed, the school's new music program began to flourish. Students from other grades joined. Parents donated old instruments. The principal arranged for a small stage to be built in the courtyard for performances. And every afternoon, the sound of music drifted through the open windows. For the teachers who once mocked her, it was humbling to watch. They began helping out with the events, carrying chairs, setting up stands, even encouraging students. The teasing and gossip slowly disappeared, replaced by quiet admiration. One day, the principal called a meeting. "We've been invited to perform at the district showcase next month," he said. "I want our students to represent our school. Lena, would you lead them?" She was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I'll help them prepare." After the meeting, as she walked through the hallways, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. She had once performed for crowds of strangers, but now she would help these young hearts find their own voices. That evening, when she returned home, she looked at her reflection in the window again. The woman looking back was no longer hiding. There was strength in her eyes and peace in her smile. She whispered softly to herself, "Maybe life doesn't take things away. Maybe it just gives them back in a different way." Then she picked up her violin and played one more song before bed, a song of quiet gratitude, a song that spoke of healing and second chances. And as the last note faded, she knew that her story wasn't about losing fame or finding it again. It was about rediscovering the part of herself that had never truly gone away. The news about the district showcase brought a new kind of energy to the school. Students who once dragged their feet through the hallways now stayed back after class, practicing in the music room until the sky outside turned orange. The sound of violins, flutes, and small drums filled the air. Laughter mixed with music, and for the first time, the school felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Lena watched her students with quiet pride. She never raised her voice, never demanded perfection. When someone played the wrong note, she smiled gently and said, "Don't worry. Every mistake is part of learning." The children listened to her as if she were the most patient person in the world. They tried again and again, eager to make her proud. She could see herself in them, nervous, hopeful, and full of dreams. Every time one of them looked up at her with shining eyes, she felt something stir in her heart. It wasn't the feeling of fame or recognition. It was the pure joy of seeing someone discover what they were capable of. In the staff room, things had changed too. The teachers no longer whispered or laughed behind her back. Instead, they asked how rehearsals were going, offered to help with the stage setup, and even brought snacks for the students after practice. Mr. Clark had become one of the biggest supporters, often staying late to move chairs and tune instruments. One evening, as the last students left, he lingered near the doorway. "You know," he said quietly, "I've learned more from watching you these past few weeks than from all my years of teaching." Lena looked up from packing her violin. "What do you mean?" He smiled awkwardly. "Patience, Grace, the way you make everyone feel seen. I used to think teaching was about control, but you've shown it's about trust." She gave him a kind smile. People don't grow when they're afraid. They grow when they're believed in. He nodded, thinking about her words long after she left the room. As the day of the showcase grew closer, excitement spread through the town. Parents began talking about it at the local market. The principal received calls from nearby schools asking if the rumors were true, if their once quiet teacher was leading the performance. The attention made some nervous, but Lena stayed calm. The night before the event, she gathered her students for one last rehearsal. The air was warm and the sound of crickets hummed outside. The children sat in a circle, their instruments resting on their laps. Lena looked around at their faces, some anxious, some eager, and said softly, "Tomorrow, don't think about who's watching. Don't worry about mistakes. Just feel the music. Let it tell your story." One boy raised his hand. "Miss, aren't you scared?" She smiled gently. "Once I was. But fear doesn't mean you can't do something. It just means it matters to you. And that's a good thing." When they finished, the students clapped for her before heading home. Lena stayed behind alone for a while, walking slowly around the empty room. The instruments were scattered. The air smelled faintly of wood and dust, and her heart was full. She touched the edge of the piano, remembering her younger self on big stages chasing perfection. How different it felt now, softer, realer. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window holding her violin in her lap. The moonlight fell across her face and memories came rushing back. Of applause, of her family sitting in the front row, of the day everything fell apart. The ache was still there, but it no longer hurt the same way. She had learned to carry it differently. When morning came, she dressed simply as always, tying her hair neatly and putting on her light gray sweater. She arrived early at the venue, helping students tune their instruments and calm their nerves. The stage was large, brighter than what they were used to, and the audience seats seemed endless. Parents, teachers, and guests began filling the hall. The principal stood near the entrance, beaming with pride. As the program began, small groups from different schools performed one after another. Some danced, others sang. Then it was their turn. Lena led her group to the stage, her heart steady. The children followed, holding their violins carefully, trying not to trip over wires and stands. When they stood in position, the crowd quieted. The principal introduced them. From Green Hill School, led by Miss Lena, our newly formed music class. Polite applause followed. Lena glanced at her students and gave a reassuring nod. Then she lifted her bow and began to play. The first few notes were soft, uncertain, but she guided them gently. Soon the students joined in, their small hands trembling slightly at first. But as the music filled the hall, their fear melted away. The sound grew richer, the rhythm steadier. The audience leaned forward, drawn in by the beauty of it, not because it was flawless, but because it was full of feeling. Each note seemed to carry the heart of every child, the effort of every practice, and the quiet strength of their teacher. When the final note faded, there was a brief silence, followed by thunderous applause. The children looked shocked at first, then grinned widely. Some even laughed from relief. Lena bowed with them, smiling softly. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about her past or her pain. She was thinking about them, her students, and how proud she was. Backstage, parents rushed to congratulate her. "You've done something special," one mother said, wiping her eyes. "My daughter never cared about school before this. Now she talks about music every day." Lena thanked her quietly, touched by the words. When the event ended and the crowd began to leave, the principal walked up to her. "You've changed this school," he said warmly. "You've reminded us what education is really about." She smiled, shaking her head. "It wasn't me," she said softly. "It was them. I just helped them listen to themselves." That night, back home, Lena sat with a cup of tea by her window. The city outside buzzed with quiet life, and her violin rested nearby. She thought about everything. The teasing, the loneliness, the rediscovery of her music, the faces of her students glowing on stage. It all felt like a full circle. As she sat there, a soft knock came on her door. When she opened it, she found Mr. Clark standing there, holding a small framed photograph. "I hope you don't mind," he said awkwardly. "One of the parents took this tonight. I thought you might want it." Lena took the photo. It was a picture of her standing on stage with her students all smiling, the spotlight shining down on them. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she said quietly, "Thank you. This means a lot." He nodded, looking humbled. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for how we treated you before." "We were wrong." She looked up, her eyes gentle. "It's all right. We all grow at our own pace." He smiled faintly, then left. After he was gone, Lena placed the photograph on her small table. She stared at it for a long time. The image wasn't grand or glamorous, but to her, it was more beautiful than any picture from her old career. It showed something real: connection, kindness, hope. For the next few days, the story of the showcase spread through the community. Local newspapers wrote short pieces about it. Parents sent letters of thanks to the school. The students became little celebrities, proudly telling everyone about their music teacher who once played for the world and chose to teach them instead. Lena never mentioned the fame part. When asked, she always said, "It's not about where you've been. It's about what you do with what you've learned." The principal soon announced that the school would create a permanent music department with Lena as its head. She was hesitant at first, but accepted. Her quiet confidence had become a source of inspiration for everyone. The same teachers who once joked about her now came to her for advice. Some even joined her classes to learn basic chords. laughing like children when they made mistakes. The school felt more like a family now, a place filled with warmth and understanding. One afternoon, as she watched her students pack up after class, a thought crossed her mind. She realized that music had given her something far greater than applause. It had given her healing, purpose, and the chance to touch lives again. When the last student waved goodbye and left the room, she sat alone for a while, letting the soft evening light fill the space. Then, quietly, she began to play. The melody was gentle, flowing like a story told without words. It spoke of the past, of pain turned into beauty, of silence turned into song, and though no one else was there to hear it, it felt like the most meaningful performance of her life. As the final note faded into the air, Lena closed her eyes and smiled. She had once played for the world. Now she played for the heart, and that was enough. After the district showcase, the story of the quiet teacher and her students began to spread far beyond the school walls. Parents who had been at the event shared short videos on social media, and within days, people from nearby towns were talking about the beautiful performance led by a woman who once preferred to stay in the background. At first, Lena didn't pay much attention to it. She continued with her daily routine, walking to school early, carrying her violin in a simple cloth case, and smiling at students as they ran past her in the hallway. But things around her were changing. People greeted her differently now. The same teachers who once teased her now spoke with warmth in their voices. Even the students treated her with new respect. One morning, as she entered the staff room, she found a small newspaper lying open on the table. A headline read, "The Hidden Virtuoso, Local Teacher's Music Touches Hundreds." She froze for a second. Her own photograph was there, a candid shot from the stage with her students playing behind her. The article described her as a talented musician who returned to teaching after years away from the spotlight. Mr. Clark noticed her standing there and smiled nervously. "They interviewed one of the parents," he said. "Word got out that you used to perform professionally. I hope that's okay." Lena sat down slowly, her hands folded on the table. "It's all right," she said softly. The truth always finds its way. Still, the memories stirred something deep inside her. She had spent years trying to leave that part of her life behind. The fame, the endless travel, the exhaustion that came with it. But now it was returning, piece by piece, like distant music growing louder. That afternoon, a group of students rushed up to her after class. "Miss, we saw your name online," one of them exclaimed. "You played in real concerts." "You were on TV!" She smiled gently, shaking her head. "That was a long time ago," she said. "What matters is what we're doing now. But you're famous," another student said, eyes wide with admiration. Lena laughed softly. "No, my dear. Fame fades. What stays is the love you put into your work." The children nodded, even if they didn't fully understand. But they looked at her differently after that. Not with fear or distance, but with wonder. Over the next few weeks, the school became a center of attention. Visitors came to watch her classes. Journalists called the principal, and small local channels asked for interviews. Lena refused most of them, preferring to let her students shine instead. One day, the principal gently insisted, "You don't have to talk about your past if you don't want to," he said. "But people could be inspired by your story." She hesitated for a long moment, then finally agreed to one short interview with a local newspaper. The reporter arrived a few days later, a young woman with a soft voice and kind eyes. They sat in the music room, surrounded by instruments. The sunlight came through the windows, casting golden patterns on the floor. "Everyone's curious about why you left the music world," the reporter said carefully. "Would you like to talk about it?" Lena looked down at her hands. "There's not much to say," she replied. "I loved music. It gave me everything. But life changes. People I loved were gone, and for a while, I lost the sound inside me." The reporter nodded quietly, sensing the weight of her words. "But one day," Lena continued, "I realized that music isn't just about performing. It's about connecting. Teaching these children brought the music back. It reminded me that beauty can grow in small places too." The reporter smiled. "That's beautiful," she said softly. The article that came out later wasn't about tragedy or loss, and it was about hope. It described how Lena had found peace by sharing her gift with others. The response was overwhelming. Letters began arriving at the school. from parents, students from other towns, even retired musicians who said her story reminded them why they loved music in the first place. One morning, she opened an envelope that came from a city she hadn't visited in years. Inside was a handwritten note. "I was in the audience at one of your concerts many years ago. I never forgot that night. Seeing your story again has reminded me to pick up my instrument. Thank you for not giving up." Lena read it twice, her eyes wet with quiet emotion. She folded the letter neatly and placed it inside her violin case. Despite all the attention, she stayed humble. She never boasted, never spoke about her past in detail. Instead, she kept teaching as she always did, patiently, kindly, believing in her students. Her classroom became a place where even shy children found courage. Some who had never played a note before began staying after school to learn. One of her smallest students, a girl who could barely hold a violin properly, came to her one afternoon and said, "Miss, I want to be like you when I grow up." Lena smiled warmly. "Then start by being yourself. That's the best kind of musician there is." Her words spread quietly through the school. Teachers quoted her in meetings. Parents mentioned her in community gatherings. She had become something more than a music teacher. She had become a symbol of kindness, perseverance, and quiet strength. Then one evening, she received a phone call that took her by surprise. It was from an old acquaintance, a man named Mr. Davies, who had once managed concert events in her earlier career. "I saw your story in the paper," he said cheerfully. "You were always special, Lena. The world deserves to hear you again. How about a performance at the City Hall next month? A charity concert, perhaps? You could raise funds for your school's music program." Her heart skipped a beat. It had been years since she'd stood on a professional stage. The thought both excited and frightened her. "I don't know," she said softly. "That part of my life feels far away now." Mr. Davies chuckled gently. "Music doesn't fade. It just waits for you to return." After she hung up, Lena sat in silence for a long time. The violin case rested beside her like an old friend patiently watching. She remembered the thrill of performing, the lights, the applause, the way the world disappeared when she played. But she also remembered the loneliness that followed, the exhaustion, the feeling of losing herself. She spent that night thinking. By morning, she had made her decision. When she arrived at school, she gathered her students and said, "How would you all feel about performing again, this time in the city?" The room filled with gasps and excitement. "Really?" they cried. "Yes," she said with a smile, "but only if we do it together." They practiced harder than ever. Word spread again and people began offering help. Parents volunteered to sew costumes, local shops donated instruments, and even the mayor sent a message of support. The whole town felt united. As the day of the concert drew near, Lena found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Not fear, but anticipation. She wasn't doing this for fame. She was doing it to give her students an experience they would never forget. The night before the concert, she stayed alone in the empty auditorium. The lights were dim and the stage stood quiet. She took out her violin and played softly, not a full song, just a few notes. Each one echoed gently in the empty space. When the sound faded, she whispered to herself, "It's time." The next evening, the concert hall was full. Families, teachers, and people from other towns filled every seat. Cameras flashed and the audience buzzed with excitement. But Lena didn't care about any of that. Her only focus was on the young faces beside her, their eyes bright with pride and nervousness. When she stepped onto the stage, she felt calm. She looked out into the crowd, then at her students, and raised her bow. The music began, a soft, heartfelt piece she had written herself, one that told her story without a single word. It started with sorrow but rose into hope, blending the past and present into something beautiful. The hall was silent except for the sound of their instruments. Every note felt alive. The children followed her lead perfectly, their faces glowing with joy. By the time the final chord faded, there were tears in the audience. People stood up, applauding with all their hearts. Lena bowed slowly, her chest tight with emotion. She had thought she'd lost this part of herself forever, but now she knew. It had only been waiting for the right reason to return. After the concert, reporters asked for interviews again, but she only said one simple thing. Music is not about showing the world who you are. It's about reminding the world that beauty still exists. That night, as she walked home under the quiet sky, She felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had faced her past, shared her gift again, and done it in the most meaningful way, not alone, but together with those who believed in her. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was running from her old life. She had finally made peace with it. The morning after the city concert, the world seemed different for Lena. The applause and excitement had faded from the stage, but the warmth remained in her heart. For the first time in many years, she felt truly at peace with herself. She had returned to music on her own terms, guided not by fame but by the love for the sound and the joy of sharing it with others. At school, her students greeted her with wide smiles. They carried their instruments proudly, as if the previous night had turned them into heroes. Some had stayed up late practicing after the concert, excited about the experience. Lena watched them quietly, her heart swelling with pride. The principal had already begun receiving letters from other schools and organizations, praising the performance. They wanted to know more about the woman who had once vanished from the music world, only to return quietly and inspire a new generation. But Lena remained humble. She never took credit for the success. She always pointed to her students. Without them, she would say softly, there would be no music at all. In the days that followed, the school's music program grew quickly. More students joined, bringing instruments from home or borrowing what the school could provide. Parents offered to volunteer during practice sessions, and the hallways were alive with the sound of violins, flutes, and soft piano notes. The music room became a haven, a place where children could express themselves, make mistakes without fear, and discover their own potential. One afternoon, as Lena guided a group of beginners through their first song, a small girl raised her hand. "Miss, do you think I could play like you one day?" Lena smiled gently. "If you keep practicing and if you listen to your heart, yes. But more than that, you will play your own music and it will be beautiful because it is yours." The girl's face lit up and Lena's heart felt light. She realized that this was her true purpose. Not the stages, not the applause, but the lives she could touch and the courage she could give. Word about Lena's story continued to spread. Local newspapers, small radio stations, and even educational magazines wanted to share her journey. Some students began to recognize her in the community, whispering excitedly to their friends, "That's our music teacher. She's amazing." Despite all the attention, Lena remained focused on her students. She knew that the magic of music wasn't in recognition but in connection. One day, a young boy who had been too shy to play in front of anyone finally gathered the courage to perform a short piece for the class. His hands trembled and the first notes were uneven, but Lena stayed close, smiling encouragingly. When he finished, the room erupted with applause. The boy's face flushed with pride. "I did it," he whispered. "Yes," Lena said softly. "You did. And that is what matters." As the weeks passed, Lena began mentoring older students, helping them prepare for recitals and local competitions. She taught them not only technique, but also patience, focus, and the importance of feeling the music rather than just playing it. Her students started showing confidence not only in music, but in other parts of their lives, speaking in class, leading small projects, and supporting one another. One day, a former student approached her quietly after class. "Miss," he said, "I didn't like school much before, but now I feel like I can do anything. You made me believe in myself." Lena's eyes softened. "I didn't do it alone. You did the work and you trusted yourself. That's what makes the difference." That evening, Lena walked home slowly, reflecting on how much had changed. The quiet, lonely life she had once led now felt full of purpose and warmth. The violin she carried wasn't just an instrument. It was a bridge between the past and present, a reminder of her own journey and the gift she could give to others. The community began to notice the difference in the school. Children who had never paid attention to lessons were now more engaged. Parents talked about how their children were more confident and disciplined. Teachers observed the positive impact, realizing that Lena's patience and care were transforming more than just music skills. They were shaping character. Then, one day, Lena received an unexpected invitation. A citywide music festival wanted her and her students to perform. It was an honor, and yet it brought a wave of anxiety. She hadn't anticipated stepping back into larger stages, but she realized this wasn't about personal glory. It was about giving her students an opportunity to shine. She called a meeting with the students, explaining the festival. Excitement filled the room, but so did nerves. Some of them worried about making mistakes in front of a larger audience. "Remember," Lena said softly, "this isn't about perfection. It's about sharing music. Each note you play tells a story, and your story matters." Practice sessions became more focused, yet they remained joyful. Lena guided the students carefully, helping them support one another. When one child stumbled, another would quietly encourage them. By the time the festival arrived, the group was ready, not because they were perfect, but because they had learned to trust themselves and each other. The day of the festival, the hall was packed. Lights shone down on the stage, and the audience murmured with anticipation. Lena led her students to their positions. Her heart was steady, calm, but beneath it there was the familiar thrill of performing. When the music began, the hall grew silent. The first notes were gentle yet filled with confidence. Lena guided her students with subtle gestures, and their small instruments blended into a beautiful harmony. Every note carried emotion, every pause held meaning. As the performance continued, Lena glanced at her students. They were focused, smiling, and playing with courage. Some were even laughing quietly at little mistakes, learning to enjoy the process rather than fear it. She felt a deep sense of pride. By the final chord, the audience erupted in applause. Some stood, clapping so loudly it echoed through the hall. Parents rushed to hug their children, and teachers wiped away tears of admiration. Lena stepped forward, bowing with her students, her eyes shining. After the performance, people from the audience approached her, praising not only the music but the impact she had on the children. Letters and messages arrived afterward from parents and educators across the city, expressing gratitude and admiration. They had witnessed something rare, the transformation of a quiet, overlooked teacher into a source of inspiration for young lives. Back at the school, Lena's music program became a permanent feature. More students joined, and the school even started offering scholarships for talented children. Lena continued to teach, her calm guidance shaping the next generation of musicians, but also nurturing confidence, patience, and kindness in every student. In the evenings, Lena would sit by her window with her violin, playing softly. These moments were no longer lonely. They were peaceful. She had rediscovered her love for music, not for fame or applause, but for the lives it could touch. One day, a former colleague from her old career visited. He watched quietly as Lena taught a group of students, smiling and correcting mistakes gently. When she finished the lesson, he approached her. "You've built something remarkable here," he said. "I always admired your talent, but now I see something greater. Your heart." Lena looked at him softly. "Talent alone doesn't change the world. Love, patience, and belief in others do." Years passed, and Lena's students grew older, carrying their experiences into high school and beyond. Many continued music, some pursued other dreams, but all remembered her guidance and encouragement. The lessons she taught went beyond notes and scales. They were lessons in courage, resilience, and the power of quiet strength. Even after retiring, Lena continued to play in small community events, sharing her music with those who needed comfort, hope, or inspiration. She became known not as a famous performer, but as a teacher, whose influence reached far beyond the classroom. One quiet evening, Lena sat by her window, the city lights twinkling below. She held her violin in her lap, fingers tracing the worn wood. She smiled, remembering the journey, the teasing, the isolation, the rediscovery of her gift, and the countless students whose lives she had touched. Her life had been full of challenges and loss, but it had also been full of beauty. And in that moment, she understood something she had always known deep down. Greatness isn't measured by applause or recognition. It is measured by the love, patience, and courage we bring into the lives of others. Lena closed her eyes and played one final song that night. Soft, warm, and full of everything she had learned. The music drifted through the quiet streets, carrying with it a story of hope, resilience, and the quiet power of a woman who had once been overlooked, but whose heart could not be ignored. And in that music, her legacy lived on, not only in the echoes of her notes, but in the hearts of all the children she had touched, teaching them to find their own voices, to play with courage, and to believe in themselves. Long after the lights faded and the applause had ended,